Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 stories where the people involved believe they encountered a crawler. In these stories, the behavior of the creatures range from seeming to be curious, aggressive and malicious as if hunting or stalking, to just plain bizarre. In fact, in one story based on the bizarre behavior of the creature, it may not be a crawler at all. Alright, let's get to the stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Eastern Kentucky. The original poster, or OP, does not say exactly where the events of this encounter took place. Until the night of the events of this story, the OP had never encountered anything paranormal. He and his friend, who we will call Jay, rode over to their friend's house on their dirt bikes to have a sleepover, with 2 brothers who will be known as S and B for the telling of this story. The home they were staying in sat on farmland in the middle of the woods. They spent the day riding their dirt bikes before going to the store to pick up some fireworks to set off that night. They stopped riding when it got dark around 7 p.m. and brought out the fireworks to have a little fun, starting with firecrackers, fountains, and other smaller fireworks. That was until his friend Jay suggested they have a Roman candle fight. During the fight, the boys had stopped to grab some more fireworks when they heard a whoosh. It turned out to be a Roman candle that got shot into the grass, but that was something they figured out later. The sound prompted S to say he thought it was a Wendigo. This comment resulted in an argument between brothers as S and B got into it about whether or not a Wendigo could even be in Kentucky. The argument ended with a pillow fight on their trampoline, and when it was done, the OP suggested they sleep on the trampoline that night. The boys agreed and they settled in, but around 9 or 10 p.m., the OP and Jay saw coyotes in the woods across the street. The OP did not like wild animals and the sight of the coyotes freaked him out, so they decided to head back inside. Plus, the stench of death hung heavy in the air, smelling like, the OP describes, like a dead animal he figured the coyotes had just killed. When going inside, the boys left their pillows and blankets on the trampoline. The sleepover continued for about an hour before they realized that their bedding was still outside. The OP and Jay were volunteered to go retrieve them. Actually, the OP admits that he is very afraid of the dark and begged Jay to go with him. Jay agreed and they headed out onto the porch, going down the stairs and making their way over to the trampoline. The OP followed behind Jay, holding onto the back of his shirt the entire way, while Jay worked the flashlight. The OP was keeping a close eye on the woods across the street to his right where the coyotes had earlier been seen, when he heard a thud to his left. There is a group of 4 trees in that direction, all of which are split at the base of the trunk and are shaped like a V. He prompted Jay to point the flashlight in that direction, but they didn't see anything, so they continued toward the trampoline. They kept going before another thump sounded, this time much louder than the first. Jay also heard the sound this time, and when he shined his light on the trees, that's when they saw what was making the noise. Between the second and third trees, they see a creature that was walking alongside them. It had just ducked behind the third tree when the light hit it, but then it stood up in the middle of the natural V that the tree created. The creature was very tall and incredibly skinny, with its ribs showing through its skin. This thing's skin was bright white and glowed softly in the light when it hit it. The OP says the eyes were the scariest part, which were 2 reflective orbs that were a dark gray-black color. He says they reflected the flashlight beams back at them. Its extremely large hands were holding on to the tree, with its long fingers wrapping around the trunk. The OP screamed at the sight of this thing while Jay stood and stared in shock after dropping the flashlight. The OP yanked him by his shirt, which he was still holding on to, and the boys took off running for the house. Jay fell behind and tripped going up the stairs as the OP raced up the stairs and across the porch for the door. He opened the door and waited for Jay to run through before slamming it, locking it, and shutting the curtains. S and B had been putting on their shoes when the OP and Jay came bursting into the house. They heard him scream at the top of his lungs and were coming to check things out. Jay, who was now standing on the couch at this point, started trying to tell them what happened while the OP started hyperventilating. He says he has anxiety and asthma, and seeing this creature triggered an asthma attack. It was the first one he had had in years. S was bewildered by the account. The OP started crying during his attack and did so for about an hour. Afterward, he could not go to sleep until about 3 in the morning. He woke up the next day, packed his things, and had his parents come get him. He ends his post saying that if anyone has any answers, he would like to hear them. This to me sounds like a crawler, and we once again have a cryptid story where the creature is following alongside the person having the encounter. It's almost like they are so curious by people that they want to follow them so they can watch them, or begin stalking them like I've heard in other stories and those I've told on this channel. It could also be hunting them, waiting for its chance to strike. Given the normally sinister, aggressive nature of crawlers, this is definitely a possibility. I'm just glad that the boys had the good sense to get out of there and that they made it back to the house safely. What do you think they saw that night? And what do you think its intentions were? The next story comes from southeastern Georgia, where the original poster has seen a creature he believes to be a crawler or skinwalker while driving at night. The reason he thinks it might be a skinwalker is due to the weird appearances of animals that seem to coincide with the encounters. The OP describes the creature as being 6 to 6.5 feet tall, emaciated, and having skin that looks as if it has been severely burned. The closest image he has seen that he can compare to this is the rake. The rake is, of course, a fake entity created for the use in creepypasta stories, but is the image that is most closely associated with a crawler. He posted his story with other crawler stories because that is the closest cryptid this being resembles. He has seen more than one of these creatures on 3 separate occasions and says it is the only time he has felt real fear in his life. The first encounter he had with this creature was while he was driving his friends home late one night. He had a car full of people and they all saw the same thing. As the car rounded a corner, they see the previously described creature standing in the middle of the road directly in front of the car. The OP hit his brakes while closing his eyes out of reflex. As he opened them, the car had just driven over the spot where the creature had just been standing, but it was nowhere to be seen. He kept driving, and after a moment of disbelief, they mentioned the being out loud. As soon as they did, the OP got the unmistakable feeling that he was being followed. He sped up to 80 miles an hour in an attempt to leave this thing behind, and because he was trying to get his friends home before their curfew, which was fast approaching. This was on a winding back road out in the country. They had almost reached their destination when he got the overwhelming feeling of danger both behind and in front of him. That's when he saw either a small cat or kitten walking down the road in front of his car, parallel to the yellow line directly in front of the driver's side tire. He swerved and missed the cat, but it didn't seem to notice the car and just kept walking straight ahead. It was too dark to see if the cat remained in the road after they passed it. Before that night, the OP says he has only seen an animal in the road once. But after this strange encounter, he started seeing animals at least once a week. Every so often, he also felt the same feeling of being followed and danger while driving those back roads. His next encounter happened while he was once again driving someone home, and according to him, this was the scariest out of the 3 encounters. It was in the same general area as the first encounter, about 2 miles away. He got about halfway to his destination when the unsettling feeling of being followed once again came over him. It happened so often though that he had gotten used to it. He was driving in a wooded area that he was unfamiliar with, but just being there sent a jolt of fear through him. He says it was the first time in his life that he had felt true fear. He mentioned this to his friend, who agreed and told him there had been some scary occurrences in the area, but said no more about the matter. When they reached his friend's house, the OP pulled up as close as he could to the front door. He did this because his friend lived on land that had a wooded front yard, and he didn't want him to have to walk that far. After his friend made it inside, the OP began backing his car up to leave. This is when he felt the presence of a creature behind him. But what he saw was a creature run through the yard in front of him. It was a different creature that matched the same description as the first, 6 to 6.5 feet tall, emaciated, and closely resembling the rake. The only difference was, and this is how he knew it was a different creature, is that this being was bigger than the first one he had seen. He doesn't say if he means a little bit taller or bulkier though, just bigger than the first. It ran behind a shelter in his friend's yard. The OP once again had the feeling come over him that he was in immediate danger, except this was the second creature he had seen and there could possibly be two in his immediate vicinity. He sped down the driveway and onto the dirt road, but as he passed a wall to his right, a dog jumped out of the brush from a ledge and landed in the road. It did not chase his car, but rather just stood there barking as he swerved around it. After he passed it, it just stood there staring. He drove straight home and did not come to a full stop the entire way. The third encounter this poor guy would have with what he perceived to be a crawler was the least eventful and, fortunately for him, was very far away. He had once again just dropped a friend off after giving them a ride home. He came around a curve and turned his brights on to see something in the distance. It looked just like the first two he had previously seen, but this creature had bright white skin. This was in an area that was approximately 3 to 6 miles away from his first two encounters. Since his third encounter, he has seen several animals walking along the side of the road, with some of them being disfigured and some walking slower than what they should with a car approaching. One instance in particular sticks out to the OP when he was on his way to church. He came to a stop sign and there was a line of birds placed across his lane. He had to drive into the other lane to get around them, and when he came back by the spot later that night at around 8 p.m., the birds were gone. He points out there was no evidence the birds had ever been there, no blood or anything. They had vanished without a trace. After the first encounter, he spoke with his friend about it and they mentioned that it might be a skinwalker because of the kitten in the road. It was after this conversation that the aggressive behavior picked up. He posted his story hoping someone could help him find some answers. I believe I'd stop riding those back roads if at all possible and make his friends find their own way home. All joking aside though, they can get home on their own. Just kidding again. Seriously though, get off of those back roads. And the sense of being followed? In my last video, I talked about cryptids following people and have heard stories about crawlers doing just that. Again, I'm not sure what draws them to a particular person, but I don't think it is a coincidence he has had this many encounters. As for the animals, that's just weird and I'm not sure what to make of that. I don't think this is a skinwalker, but regular sightings of animals after only seeing one before his encounter started is just bizarre. The description of the creature doesn't match though. What do you make of that? And what do you think he is seeing? Crawlers or something else? The next story comes from a poster who tells about her friend's encounter with what they perceive to either be a crawler or skinwalker outside of her apartment. She posted her friend's story in hopes that someone could help them identify if it is one of these two cryptids or if it is something else. She does not say exactly where this story takes place, just that it was in southern Saskatchewan, Canada. The original poster's friend was sitting in a car with her friend in her apartment complex's parking lot during the night of the encounter. Her apartment is located near a park where the land is more spacious as opposed to the rest of the city where she resides. The park is on the edge of the city near a forest. There is a field behind her building that stretches the length of about 200 yards. While her friend is sitting in the car, she looks over at the fence separating her complex from the open field beyond and sees a humanoid figure. The OP says they aren't really sure of the color of this thing because of how dark it was outside, and it could have made the creature look darker than what it really was. But it was very tall and really thin. It stood upright on two legs and had a large head and very long arms. It walked in an abnormal manner, like it was shuffling along, wobbling, or limping. The OP's friend describes its gait as walking like one side of its body was heavier than the other. She pointed the being out to her friend and they both just stared at it in disbelief. The OP later asked the driver what she saw and she described the same thing as her friend did. The OP has never heard of a creature that fits this description and hopes by posting online that someone might know what her friend saw that night. She is reluctant to call the being a skinwalker or crawler because of the abnormally large head. Neither cryptid it is close to in appearance has a head described the way her friends said this one looked. At first read, I thought crawler, maybe Wendigo, but the description of the head throws me off a little, as well as the way the OP's friend describes this thing walking. Crawlers, skinwalkers, and Wendigo are all swift and fluid in their movements, not slow and clunky like this thing was, unless of course it was injured. Another thought that comes to mind is an alien. Greys, as they are often called, are usually described with larger heads. I included it with the other crawler stories because its description is closer to that than anything else, except maybe an alien. What do you think this creature was? The final story of this episode takes place at the end of the summer back in 2013, when the original poster was 20 years old. Before seeing this creature, which she believes to be a crawler, she had only thought beings like this existed in folklore and horror movies. She doesn't watch movies like that because of the effect they have on her, so when she saw this thing, she had nothing to base it off of. This resulted in her thinking she was crazy. The encounter she had took place at her parents' house. They live out in the country on a few acres of land and their home has orchards directly behind it. Their land was surrounded by hundreds of acres of almond trees, which included a river about 4 miles from their home. She points out that there are also canals all over the place in the area. The OP's family grew weed and it was time to harvest it. The OP's father and uncle were heading out that night and asked her cousin and his friends to watch over the crop. The OP asked to tag along because she wanted to hang out with them and because she had a huge crush on one of her cousin's friends. They went out and were out there for about an hour or two when they heard something out in the orchards. The sound they heard lasted for a few seconds before it faded into the night. It did not sound like any animal they had ever heard. Curious as to what it was, they decided to go check it out, with 2 people from the group remaining behind. The moon was full that night, which fully illuminated the orchards and surrounding land. They ventured into the orchard using a dirt path that is bigger than the narrow roads running through the trees to allow access for machines, sprayers, and other equipment. The OP squatted down at different points during their walk to see if she could see below the trees, looking for anyone or anything that wasn't supposed to be out there. But she didn't see anything. They had almost walked all the way through the second orchard when they decided to head back. That's when a gut feeling came over her that was so overwhelming she could only describe it as primal fear. She wanted to take off running, but at the same time she felt frozen in place. She looked over to her right and that's when she saw it, about 4 or 5 rows over from their current position. By her estimate, this creature was 7 to 8 feet tall and gangly. She was looking at its side profile and noticed its sunken cheeks and deep, hollow eye sockets. It had grayish white skin and the texture looked to her like that of a dolphin. It looked to be no more than just flesh and bone, but she says not in a way that made it look like it was starving, but instead, it looked to be naturally built this way. It walked along parallel to them, but didn't look in her direction. She wanted to run, but felt like this thing would chase her if she did. She remained close to the group and didn't say anything because they liked trouble. They turned a corner and the creature disappeared, and she did not see it again. The thing she remembers most about this creature was the shadows moving and changing on its face and head as it walked through the trees. While reading other stories, she has seen 2 other people describe beings like this and them having skin that looked like that of a dolphin. Seeing this sent chills up her spine each time. It confirmed to her that she was not alone in seeing one of these beings and that she was not crazy. She hasn't seen one of these creatures since, and that's just fine with her. She hopes she never does again. But seeing this creature does make her question what else is out there. However, she does not want to find out. This to me sounds like a crawler. However, they aren't usually described as being that tall. Normally, they are said to be about 6 to 6.5 feet in height, but who's to say they can't get that tall? As for her describing the skin as looking to have the texture of a dolphin, this is the first I've heard of that, but it does give me a more vivid picture of these beings. It was probably smart for her not to run, as I've heard stories where these things do chase people. I don't know how she remained so calm though, walking along with her friends acting as if nothing was wrong. It was probably nerve-wracking to say the very least. In any case, I'm glad she hasn't seen this creature again or seen anything else out there. What do you think this thing was? And what do you make of its behavior? This one to me seems more curious than anything else, as it followed along beside them. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.